Welcome and good afternoon or evening or morning, depending where you are. My name is George Perkovich. I'm a vice president for studies at the Carnegie Endowment, and it's my pleasure to welcome those of you who are our guests now, and especially our two speakers. We're here to address and celebrate Rose Gottemoeller's publication of her memoir, Negotiating the New START Treaty. And to lead us into that celebration and discussion, we have Peter Baker, the senior White House correspondent of the New York Times. I'm going to say a little more about Rose, but in introducing Peter, for those of you who may not remember or are too young, he and his wife, Susan Glazer, were correspondents in Moscow years ago. So very familiar with topics of arms control and also of Russia, of which Rose is a longtime veteran. And Peter and Susan also recently published a masterful biography of James Baker, the man who ran Washington, which is sitting behind me right here, and which I commend to all of you. Not mostly because of the discussion of nuclear arms control, because that's never a really sexy topic for a general biography of a Secretary of State, but it's an excellent book, and we're thrilled to have Peter here talking with Rose. What can I say about Rose? I've known Rose for about 30 years, and she has, in all of that period, been arguably the United States' leading expert on Russian military and nuclear-related issues, and an absolutely formidable negotiator and leader of the executive branch. When people would ask me what's Rose like, and I would just say, she's just the most positive person I know. I can't understand it. When things are so difficult and the challenges are so great, Rose always has some positive take on how we could get something done. And God bless her for that. And one of the results is the New START Treaty, which is the topic, again, of her book, and which is a current issue because the world is hoping or demanding that the U.S. and Russia resume nuclear arms control in the next couple of years. The clock's ticking on the New START Treaty. And whoever does that negotiation, and I wish it would be Rose, but whoever does it, is going to need to and benefit from the insights that Rose can present. So let me thank both Rose and Peter and get out of your way and enjoy the conversation that follows. Thanks very much.
Thanks, George.
Well, George, thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you for including me in this great program. I'm delighted to be here today with Rose Gottemoeller. I haven't known her as long as George has, but I'd say we probably go back close to 20 years, I'm thinking. We did not overlap much in Moscow. I think we were leaving right around the time you were arriving to head the Carnegie Center there, but we knew each other from back and forth with Washington, and we've known each other obviously over the years. And I did cover actually a lot of that happened with the negotiation of the New START Treaty, which is why I'm delighted to be able to read this book and then talk about this book, because now finally the real story can be told. And all the things I couldn't figure out at the time as a reporter are in Rose's book. I recommend it heartily for anybody. It's super smart. Obviously, there's lots of really important stuff in there. There's lots of fun stuff in there. And there's some interesting and important lessons in there too. We learn obviously more about throw rates and telemetry for those who might not be as up to speed on those as some of us are. We also learned something I didn't know, for instance, that this town of Geneva, where they did all the negotiations, has a law against flushing your toilet after 11 p.m. at night. We learned about the mannequins who showed up for an important negotiation. We learned what it's like to be the first woman ever to lead a nuclear arms control negotiation like this after decades of back and forth between Moscow and Washington. So Rose's book is terrific. I really recommend it highly. Rose, let's just start off. Tell us, why did you write this book? It's been 10 years now since this treaty was signed and ratified. Why is it important to look back at it now?
Thanks, Peter. I'll just say one thing. I do remember when I first arrived in Moscow, and you and Susan took me out to lunch and kind of showed me the ropes of what it was like to be in Moscow during that period, which was back in, for me, it was 2006 to 2008. And so I just wanted to say a big thank you to begin with, because I was a real neophyte in terms of living in Moscow. I'd been there many times, but you and Susan really had some good advice for me at that moment. But talking about decades going by, I have had this book rattling around in my head for a while, and I've been reflecting all the time. I was Undersecretary of State following the negotiation of the New START Treaty. And then when I went to NATO in 2016 for 3 years, I was reflecting on the New START Treaty negotiations. It was such a moment where we were able to do so much with the Russians. And then afterwards, things sped downhill. And the invasion of Crimea in 2014 was a signal moment, I think, a signal moment in the wrong direction. But it just made me want to reflect and reflect hard on what makes a negotiation work, even between two countries who oftentimes are at odds over national security issues, human rights issues, issues of democracy. There are so many ways we differ with Moscow, but there are also ways that we've been able to accomplish a lot in nuclear reductions over the years. So I really wanted to reflect on my experience as it informs that bigger picture.
Well, I think that's exactly a good point, because people don't realize that as hostile as things are with Russia right now, and they are, and it's a pretty rotten moment for the relationship, no question about it. But there are still continuing cooperation in discrete areas behind the scenes, including the execution of this treaty, the verification, the meetings between the bilateral, consultative committee, I think it's called, and I think there are other examples, our continuing cooperation in the space program and other things. But it represents this treaty. It does feel like it represents the end of an era, right? The last moment, at least, when we could still do something pretty big together that had import and consequence. And I don't know whether we could find a way to do that again today. We're going to test that, I suppose, in the next 5 years, right? Because President Biden extended your treaty for another 5 years, but then it expires. So by 2026, either there's a replacement for it or it goes out of force. Tell us a little bit about, though, we talked about it for a second. Tell us about being the first woman as a chief arms control negotiator. What difference did it make as far as you can tell? The Russians, of course, are famously tough on American women that we've sent over there over the years. Hillary Clinton and Condi Rice would tell you stories about how they were treated. What was it like for you in this negotiation to sit in that chair?
There's no question Russians are famously misogynistic, and indeed there are many examples out there of that, and I've suffered some of it myself. I will say that in some ways I've been working in this area of nuclear arms control and nuclear force structure and doctrine for so long that in some ways I'm considered one of the guys among the expert community. And I think those 3 years I spent as director of the Carnegie Moscow Center right before diving into negotiation of the treaty were vital, because I spent a lot of that time running a regular seminar in Moscow, where I was trying to bring members of both parties over. I remember I had Bob Joseph come over. That was a really great seminar. But I also had people from the Democratic side of the aisle come over to talk about where we were headed, what we needed to accomplish going forward. Again, this was over a decade ago now. But I think that I had a little bit of a reputation of being one of the guys on nuclear matters. And so that helped a bit. But I did have a really tough episode with my very respected, actually, negotiator on the other side of the table, Anatoly Antonov, who's now the ambassador of Russia in the United States, of course, now back in Moscow on consultations. But I have to say, we had a tough incident, but we got over it and developed, I think, a good mutual working relationship. What surprised me was the degree to which my own delegation had trouble with a woman as a chief negotiator, and really demanded that I show some temper, that I'd be able to pound the table. And to me, that was one of the funnier episodes, but it was dead serious. And to have the respect of my own people, I needed to throw a temper tantrum at least once.
What do you think that is? Is that just the way men who have done this over the years think it ought to be done because they did it that way, and if you don't do it that way, somehow it's not being done in a adequately strong fashion?
I think the women who are watching today can all relate to the notion that you can be saying absolutely the same thing in a tough tone of voice, but if you're not a man, then somehow the expectation is you're not doing it quite right. So I think it's just that old-fashioned difference in expectations, difference of impression, viewpoint, and we all have to get over it. My temper tantrum helped, and I never had that problem again. I was just rereading the book again recently as I was finishing up the final editing process. And actually, I did end up throwing two tantrums, but one came quite naturally because of some Russian behavior.
What was the Russian behavior?
Well, in that case, they had really come a long way in making some major steps forward in the negotiations. But suddenly in December of 2009, they pulled a lot of those steps off the table. As I said in the book, it was a case of not 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but it was 2 steps forward, then 10 steps back. And it was a really difficult moment in the negotiations. In my view, that was the point at which the then Prime Minister, Vladimir Putin, woke up to the negotiations and began to try to press his influence in Moscow. If those watchers and viewers today will recall, at that point in time, it was Dmitry Medvedev who was president of the Russian Federation and President Obama's counterpart. But in December of 2009, Putin stepped forward and began to really inject himself into the negotiations.
Well, tell us a little bit more about that. He basically trashes the negotiations in public, but then within hours, the story on state media disappears. What was you're left to try to figure out what Churchill, of course, called the riddle wrapped in the mystery and enigma, or whatever the exact quote was. How are you interpreting this? Because in theory, Medvedev is the president, but we all know Putin is still there, and we didn't know exactly how it was working inside their administration. How did you interpret that?
I differ somewhat with the experts across our field of Russia studies who say that Medvedev never exerted any influence in his position as president. I think the experience of the New START treaty negotiations is one case when he actually did stand up to Putin and was able to press forward. The incident you're talking about occurred again in December of 2009. It was we were really driving hard to try to get the treaty done. But Putin gave a speech out in Vladivostok where he really trashed the treaty and was very angry at the notion that the treaty wasn't going to limit missile defenses and made that known publicly. But within a very few hours, the stories about that speech had been taken down from state media. And all I could conclude, because I thought the negotiations were over at that point. I was convinced that was it. But within a very few hours, it was clear that the negotiations could go forward. And my conclusion had to be that someone stepped forward, and that someone had to be the president of the Russian Federation. I don't know who else could have done it.
Mm-hmm. What do you think would have happened had Putin still been president and been the main interlocutor at that point? Would there have been a treaty?
It's difficult for me to tell because, to be honest with you, Vladimir Putin has now really supported the New START treaty, and it didn't just happen recently. After the treaty entered into force and began its implementation, he began to refer to it publicly as the gold standard of nuclear treaties. So I think he came to see the value of it, perhaps because of many briefings from the Ministry of Defense. I know the Ministry of Defense and the General Staff has supported the treaty, but he's been very supportive of the treaty since its negotiations. So I have to say that perhaps the negotiations would have gone forward and accomplished what we wanted to do, which was to reduce strategic offensive forces. And we, from the outset, were very clear that that's what the treaty would be about. And that's exactly what President Obama and President Medvedev agreed in London as we got started in April of 2009, that the negotiations would be about strategic offensive forces and reducing them.
I'm guessing we have a lot of wonky people on here who know much more about this than I do. So for them anyway, and for those who don't really know much about this, what was the difference? What was the biggest difference between the New START treaty and the START treaty that had gone out of force or went out of force during Obama's presidency? Why don't we just simply extend the old one?
The biggest thing about New START that is different from START is this tremendous innovation of actually confirming the number of warheads on the front ends of missiles. Historically, and this went for the START treaty, it went for the INF treaty, historically we had used counting rules in order to determine approximately how many warheads were on the front ends of missiles. So for example, the SS-18 was flight tested with a maximum of 10 warheads. We used those flight tests to determine the counting rule. Flight tested with 10 warheads maximum, it was counted with 10 warheads maximum. But our Navy began to pay a price for that in the START treaty because we had started to download some of our submarine-launched ballistic missiles And as a result, they were counted at a higher level than they were actually loaded with warheads. And this was a disadvantage that the Navy wanted to fix in New START. So we started actually now going away from counting rules and confirming through reentry vehicle on-site inspections and other related verification measures the number of warheads on the front ends of missiles. So this is a more precise count, and really I think helps us in the future as we get at directly limiting warheads as we've never done in the past. I know that's a big priority for the next phase of negotiations, to directly limit warheads, and reentry vehicle on-site inspection in New START will help us do that.
What the experience of the last 10 years, we've seen the United States pull out of the INF Treaty because we accused Russia of cheating. What has been our experience with verification of this treaty? How effective is it? How rigorous has compliance been?
You know, it's really interesting, Peter, because even with the grave differences between our countries, with the invasion of Crimea, everything that's been going on, the inspectors have been really behaving throughout in a very professional way, and both sides have said and confirmed in the Bilateral Consultative Commission, the implementing body of the treaty, that that the treaty is being implemented properly with its on-site inspections and other related notifications and exchanges of data and measures that all add up to implementation of the treaty. The difficulty nowadays is because of COVID, because of the COVID-19 pandemic. We haven't actually been able to conduct on-site inspections for the last year. So I'm really hopeful that we can get back to them quickly. It's nobody's fault, of course. It's not a compliance issue, but it is something that we need to get back and get our boots on the ground. I'm sure the Russians are eager to get their boots on the ground in our facilities as well. Likewise, the meetings of the Bilateral Consultative Commission need to get back underway, and I'm sure they will before too long.
Now, the treaty, of course, is a product of 2011, but since then, the Russians have, from time to time, said we are introducing new weapons, we're developing new means of delivery, we're doing this and that, this kind of missile, that kind of missile. How does that treaty, how do those relate to the treaty? In other words, does the treaty cover those things, or does it need to be modernized to cover weapons that we didn't envision 10 years ago?
It's a mixed picture. When Putin gave his famous speech in 2018 talking about some, as people call them, exotic new kinds, well, actually, two of those missile systems are already coming under the New START treaty. That is the Sarmat heavy ICBM, which according to the definitions of the treaty fits under New START anyway, so the Russians will bring it under New START. But also, interestingly, their new hypersonic glide vehicle system called Avangard, which is launched on a regular ICBM, the so-called SS-19 two-stage ICBM used to launch that system. And so the Russians have said it too will fall under the New START treaty, and they've actually already exhibited it to bring it under the treaty. That's the procedure by which a system, a new kind of an existing missile is brought, a new type of an existing missile is brought in. Now, the problem is these exotic systems like the Poseidon sea-launched system, there's a nuclear-propelled torpedo, nuclear-propelled cruise missile. These are systems, and the Kinjal, which is an air-launched ballistic missile. The questions are, how to get them under constraint now, and I think that will be an important priority for the next stage of negotiations. Indeed, we understood for a long time that we would be trying in the next stage of negotiations, and indeed we will focus as a priority on bringing these new kinds under the next treaty.
One of the things we talk about, of course, is how tough it is to deal with the Russians, but you also had the White House and the State Department back home to manage. So you sort of had it on both ends a little bit. And I was struck by how much you talk in the book about the tensions that were there with the White House. They didn't feel like things were moving fast enough. They were giving you a lot of grief. Why were you, eating turkey on Thanksgiving when you should be out there, negotiating this treaty and getting it done? Tell us a little bit about that tension between you in Geneva and the White House and State Department back home.
Yes, I think part of the problem was, frankly, the major problem was that very few people in the Obama administration remembered what it's like to put together a major arms control treaty. I had worked on the START negotiations back in 1990 and 1991. I was there for only total of about 12 weeks, but those negotiations went on for approximately 6 years. It took time to put together that behemoth treaty, 600 pages, and a lot of technical detail and a lot of parts and moving pieces associated with it. But nobody really had that kind of muscle memory in the Obama administration. So I think out in Geneva, we were under a lot of pressure, and we knew we were, because from the very outset, it was clear we were trying to replace the START treaty, which was going out of force in December of 2009, with a new treaty in time for December 2009. We only got started in April, so that's like warp speed. And as I mentioned in the book, I'm glad nobody examined that goal too closely, because really it was impossible to consider getting a treaty negotiated and through the Senate advice and consent process and into force in about 8 months' time. Just, warp speed. But we actually, I think, were helped by the fact that there was a fire lit under us. It helped that the Russians had the same instructions to get START replaced as quickly as possible. So they were not slow rolling either. But I think there was some real sense in Washington, why do you need all these experts out there in out there in Geneva? Why are you sitting there so long? Can't you just, couple of days in Geneva, you can get through these issues and the treaty will be done, presto. Well, that's just not the way it works. And especially when we're working on a major new innovations in the verification regime, like the on-site inspection regime I was talking about for reentry of vehicles, those details take some time to work out. And well, like I said, nobody in Washington understood that.
Well, tell us a little bit about then what it was like in Geneva. Tell us, how many people did you have? How many days a week did you actually sit with the Russians? What was, how hours a day? You speak Russian. Did you use translators? Give us a picture of sort of like the daily life and the picture of this team that you were leading there.
In some sense, very traditional. We worked in traditional plenaries, and anybody who's sat at one of those plenary tables will recognize it. You have your team with you at the table of lead negotiators, and your interpreter sitting next to you, and behind you is the group of experts, and you exchange talking points. Well, that does happen. It's important. These plenaries are important ceremonial moments, important record-keeping moments, but they're not where the actual work gets done. The delegations break up into working groups, and we had working groups for every part and piece of the treaty, from the verification regime, the inspection regime, to how we do conversion and elimination, to how we put together the database. There were lots of working groups out there of experts working together. And my counterpart and I, Anatoly Antonov, we got together regularly in what were called heads of delegation meetings, where we would get together, just the two of us, with two note takers. And I think this was an important thing that both of us spoke. Obviously, he spoke Russian, I spoke English, but I speak Russian and he speaks English. And so we were able to work very, very quickly in that way, getting through issues that would come to our attention. What would happen is the working groups would do their thing, try to get as far as they could on all the technical details. But if they couldn't solve something, they brought it to us. They brought it up the chain, so to say, and then we would wrestle with it in our heads of delegation meetings. But I think the fact that we both spoke each other's languages, and we both had great note takers who were bilingual as well, we could really get through a lot of issues quickly and try to develop a joint understanding as quickly as possible. And I want to say, for those of you who know Anatoly Antonov, he's got a reputation for a tough negotiator. Oftentimes he's been known to be kind of nasty in exchanges in various diplomatic settings. But I have to say, he was a really significant problem solver in these negotiations, and I appreciated that very much. I hope he can say the same about me.
Well, you talk about people bringing up the chain, bigger problems. When did you do that? When did you involve Secretary Clinton, for instance, or President Obama even? He talked to Medvedev a number of times during this negotiation. At what point do you bring in the heavy guns?
Absolutely. And I want to stress that is important in any negotiation. I think the reason that we actually got New START done in record time, we got the treaty done in 1 year, from April to April 2009 to April 2010. That was warp speed. That was really fast. And the reason we got that done is because the president himself was willing to be involved and engaged regularly with his counterpart, President Medvedev. Also, I have to say that Secretary Clinton was very involved with Minister Lavrov. But, the person who came out and helped us in person a couple of times was Mike Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He came to Geneva once to meet with his counterpart, the chief of the general staff, General Gerasimov. He came to Geneva once, and then he came to Moscow also in January of 2010 to break through some important roadblocks that were facing us and really helped us to make progress a lot. So obviously, high-level intervention is so important. You need to strike a balance somehow to try not to have to engage the top level too much, but sometimes you just have to turn to them to get their help. And I have to tell you, it's so funny when I look back on it, but President Obama and President Medvedev became great experts on telemetry and had many discussions about it. I think they even got to kind of joking about telemetry in their phone calls and various encounters, because it was a highly technical issue, but it was not one that really was so central to the New START treaty as it was to the START treaty. Again, because we were not using counting rules. Telemetry and telemetry exchanges are part of how we determine the flight test data and so understand how to determine the counting rules. Well, we didn't need it in quite the same way in the New START treaty, but the two presidents really put their shoulders to that wheel, and I have to say I appreciate it very, very much. But that's an example. Usually you don't want your principal to have to deal with something quite so technical, but I was grateful that President Obama was willing to be engaged.
Well, as you say, of course, the treaty was signed a year later in April of 2010. And then you go to Senate, and you devote a lot of this book actually to the ratification process that begins with the Senate consideration, advice, and consent. So you know what question I'm going to ask you. Who's more of a pain in the butt to have to negotiate with, the Russians or the senators?
Excellent question, Peter. I asked myself that a lot through the year plus that it took both to negotiate the treaty and then get it through the ratification process. I think in the end of the day, the Russians, in a way, although the issues were very, very difficult, substantively very, very difficult, and we had many, many difficult moments and even crisis moments in the negotiations. But the senators were, I would say, more complicated because we needed to engage them and engage their interest. To be honest with you, just as there wasn't much muscle memory in the administration with regard to how to negotiate a complicated treaty, there wasn't a lot of memory on Capitol Hill and in the Senate about strategic arms reduction treaties in the past and what it takes to both negotiate one, but then also their importance to the United States, their national security importance to the United States. So luckily we still had Senator Lugar with us, God rest his soul, but he was the trail boss on the Senate side, who really from the very outset pushed hard and was very confident that we would get the Republican votes that we needed. And I think that was very important to have both his knowledge and his experience and also his confidence in the process to push things along. And indeed, he was very helpful in getting some senators to step forward early, Senator Corker and Senator Isaacson, and say that publicly that they were willing to vote for the New START treaty. So we could build on that. But it did take time and effort. And if I may just mention one more thing, I wanted to mention the role of the Senate Observers Group, the so-called National Security Working Group. They came out to Geneva. This started way back when, in earlier years, when it was necessary also to try to interest the Senate in nuclear arms reduction negotiations. They were called the Arms Control Observers Group in those days, and they came out to Geneva and would sit and observe the negotiations, sometimes try to meddle in the negotiations, which the executive branch is always watchful for. The president, of course, being responsible for negotiating treaties, the Senate giving their advice and consent. So we had a visit from Senator Kyle and also from Senator Feinstein. They came out in November of 2009 as the Senate National Security Working Group, as it's called today. And they were very important, I think, to highlighting some key issues. And also they were providing us the kind of starting gun for the ratification fight, because the issues they raised proved to be front and center in the ratification fight.
sort of a heads up on what was going to happen. We're going to take questions in a few minutes. So anybody who has questions, go ahead and start. You can put them in the comments channel, and we'll go from there. So you mentioned Senator Kyle. Now, he plays such an interesting role in this. He is perhaps the most engaged of the critical senators, Republican senators, who are skeptical of this treaty, and he negotiates a deal basically with the Obama administration. Correct me where I get it wrong, but he negotiates a deal basically where he gets a lot of commitment for money to modernize the nuclear arsenal. That's his priority. He's from Arizona, of course, and yet in the end he doesn't vote for it. Now, what kind of deal is that? In your view, I never understood this. Was he negotiating in good faith, or was this bad faith? And if it was bad faith, why did Obama go ahead and give him what he wanted anyway, rather than pull back?
Well, first of all, I think that President Obama was mindful that he would be responsible for starting a nuclear modernization during his presidency. It was high time to do so. I think that Senator Kyle accelerated the process and really pulled it into sharp focus, both for President Obama and for then Vice President Biden as well. It wasn't only the nuclear triad modernization, of course, but also fissile material matters, pit production for warheads. All of these issues were very important to Senator Kyle. And he really, I think, highlighted for the administration their importance, starting during his visit to Geneva in November of 2009. I do think that it's interesting because along the road, there were those who thought that he would vote for the treaty right along, and I always assumed that he would. But some important figures, and Vice President Biden was among them, at the time said, I'm not counting on his vote. So there were, I think, some very experienced people who didn't think in the end of the day that he would vote for the treaty. But I always carried the assumption along that he would, because essentially he was getting what he wanted.
So what do you think? Why do you think he didn't then? I mean, it can't be a domestic, political issue, because I don't think that too many people back home, their constituents, are voting based on what you do on a treaty like this. I suppose his base might be anti-Obama, and therefore anything you do that seems pro-Obama could be troublesome, I suppose. But it just felt like, having gotten what he wanted, to then not actually deliver on his side of it was striking.
Well, I thought it was striking too. And so I guess that question you'll have to ask Senator Kyle, Peter, when you get the chance. I can't speak to it. I was quite puzzled the day he went and made his floor speech right before the vote on December 22nd of 2009. I was shocked, actually. But at that time, it was already clear we were going to get the votes we needed to get us across the 67 mark. And in the end of the day, we got 72 votes in favor of the treaty. So we didn't need either his vote, or as it turned out, Senator McCain's vote. Either senator at the time from Arizona, neither of them was willing to vote for the treaty. That's kind of a funny story about Senator McCain. Perhaps I should just tell it. Is that okay?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, we... and particularly at that time, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, John Kerry, thought that Senator McCain was eminently gettable. Obviously, he was the ranking member on the Senate Armed Services Committee, very knowledgeable about these issues overall. But when Senator Kerry and I, Chairman Kerry and I, went to talk to him about his vote 2 days before, 2 nights, actually, we were working late at night, 2 nights before the vote, he was absolutely furious about the issue of gays in the military, because at that time, President Obama was beginning to move away from the Clinton-era policy of don't ask, don't tell, and Senator McCain was simply furious about it. So on that occasion, when we were meeting with him, trying to talk to him about the importance of the New START treaty, he said, very angry, he said, I'm not voting for this treaty because I'm disagreeing with President Obama's position on gays in the military. And he stormed out of the meeting. And that was that. Now, I do want to say I've admired Senator McCain all my life, and I've admired the way also that he stood up for various key issues throughout his career in the Senate. So at the end of the day, we didn't need his vote for the New START treaty, but that was another one that surprised me a bit.
Well, it's a good reminder, right, that sometimes people are voting on things that have absolutely nothing to do with the issue at hand, and that's part of a negotiation and part of your challenge as a policymaker who's trying to get something through a political body, right?
Absolutely.
you're right that the worst moment of your whole professional life came during this ratification debate when John Kerry, of all people, he was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee at the time, wanted to add a line to the resolution of ratification that would impose a new condition on implementation of the treaty. And Vice President Biden was there and Secretary Clinton was there. And you told him it would mean that Russia wouldn't ratify if they did it and it would kill the treaty, and he backed down. What was the condition he was trying to impose, and why was that, in your view, such a tough moment?
Well, for those of you who aren't familiar with a process of negotiating a resolution of ratification for any treaty, the resolution of ratification can express the advice of the Senate, but it shouldn't have any language in it that actually changes the legal meaning of the treaty. And what the senators were proposing, or Senator Kerry in that case was proposing, would have changed the legal meaning of the treaty. And it was related, to be honest with you, Peter, I don't remember exactly what the issue was. I know everybody wants to know what was the issue, but I can't remember. It was something to do with many senators were concerned that there was some kind of limit on missile defenses hidden somewhere in the treaty. Right. And as I recollect, the language would have imposed some kind of legal condition related to that issue. And I basically said, it's not going to fly with the Russians. They're gonna pull out of implementing the treaty. They won't ratify it, and they will not implement it. So that's the point at which basically Senator Kerry said, "Well, we'll stick with what we have," and the Vice President said, "Well, we'll stick with what we have." But there's a very funny picture in the book. There are some photos in the book. There's a very funny picture of Senator Kerry, showing me this piece of paper. Vice President Biden is looking over my shoulder, and Secretary Clinton is standing right there as well. And it's like my boss, actually my big boss, the Vice President, my boss, the Secretary of State, and the Chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee were all trying to stare me down. But I had to tell them it wasn't going to work.
Well, and they did back down, right? They did listen to your counsel and advice, which is, of course, what's important. We're going to get to questions in just a minute, so don't forget to go ahead and put some in the comments channel, or if you're watching on YouTube, I think you can ask through the YouTube channel. I may not understand the technology, that's right, but you'll figure it out. So what is really striking is you mentioned getting 72 votes for this treaty. I can't think of getting 72 votes in the Senate for anything right now. For anything. If they add a resolution saying we think mom is great, I'm not sure that you could get 72 votes for that at this point. And so is this the last of the big treaties we're ever going to see ratified? Because unlike, say, you might get rid of the filibuster, but you cannot get rid of the 2/3 requirement for advice and consent to a treaty. That's built into the Constitution. That's not going anywhere. You can't do reconciliation, which is what we talk about in Washington these days to try to get the Senate to move in a time of gridlock. Are we done with treaties? Because, and I asked that partly because President Obama then went ahead and negotiated what amounts to, in fact, an environmental treaty, a climate change treaty in Paris, but did it as an executive agreement that he didn't submit to the Senate for ratification. He negotiated a nuclear arms control treaty, in effect, with Iran, but did it as an executive agreement that he didn't submit to the Senate. The weakness of that, of course, is which we saw, which is the next president come along and undo it, because if you haven't ratified by the Senate, it's not permanently into law. So the weakness of that strategy is understandable. But is that it? Are we done with treaties that are anything even slightly significant or momentous?
Well, a lot of my good colleagues and friends, some very eminent people working in this area, have basically given up on the notion of ratifying any future treaties. But I can't say I agree with that. First of all, just the experience of getting the New START treaty through its advice and consent process. I assumed, and certainly Senator Lugar assumed from the outset, that as long as the senators had all the information they needed about the treaty and all their questions answered, that they would take their constitutional responsibility seriously to give advice and consent. Now, it is a big if, but of course they must be allowed to vote their consciences. They cannot, there cannot be insistence on a strict party line vote, and that's the problem nowadays. But I did find in working the ratification process for New START that we worked our tails off. We answered over 1,000 questions for the record right before the treaty was voted on. We were up on Capitol Hill until midnight for 2 weeks. We were really working hard to make sure that senators had all the information they needed. We had over 20 hearings. We had countless briefings, information briefings. Wherever anybody wanted to talk to us, whether in the Senate cafeteria or in the ladies' room, if I could grab a female senator, I was willing to talk about the New START treaty. Yes, everybody, women do talk about business in the ladies' room as well. But to be honest with you, I found that the senators took their responsibilities seriously. They had many questions, and yes, there was some horse trading that went on. It's transactional. Senator Kyle was a great example. He got what he wanted in terms of nuclear modernization and fissile material facility modernization. So there's transactional stuff that goes on, but they really wanted to understand the substance. Is this treaty in U.S. national interest or not? That, I think, is what the constitutional responsibility is all about. And to my mind, we should not let that go, because treaties are the highest law of the land. Yes, they can be withdrawn from. We've seen that with the Trump administration, withdrawing from INF, withdrawing from the Open Skies Treaty. So yes, they can be withdrawn from, but there are additional hoops to jump through, and we cannot let the highest law of the land go, especially when we're not just talking about arms control treaties. We're talking about really important, arms control treaties are really important, but really important things for U.S. economic health, like trade and economic treaties, commercial treaties, those kinds of things. We got to be able to vote on treaties. That's all there is to it from my perspective. But yeah, I recognize there are issues out there and definite political problems these days. But I'm one who says, let's not give up on the notion of treaties and see what we can do to continue to advance the concept and advance the notion.
That we're about to move to other questions, but the New START Treaty was envisioned originally as the first of what would be a succession of treaties that we would begin to build toward President Obama's goal of a global zero, eventually getting down to no nuclear weapons left in the world. Now, he didn't think that was going to happen in his tenure. Obviously, it was a long-term goal. But we never ended up getting to that next stage of negotiation, another treaty that would follow this one. Why is that? And is that something you see changing in the future?
It was very interesting that clearly President Obama laid out in Prague in April of 2009 his so-called Prague Initiative, where he was talking about a step-by-step approach to continue moving to reduce and eliminate nuclear weapons. And he said, it's not just in my tenure, Peter, but in my lifetime. He said, I don't expect this goal to be accomplished, but we must continue on this road. And so he wanted to work on several treaties through his time in office. But it wasn't clear to me that the Russians bought into that goal, even while we were in Geneva. I thought we could sell them on additional reductions and could work, to bring them back to the table again. But it was going to take some work to get them into another negotiation. The other thing that happened was that Dmitry Medvedev left office and Putin resumed the presidency. And there's no secret that he and President Obama just didn't hit it off. They didn't get along that well compared to the Medvedev-Obama relationship. And so pretty early on, Putin put in place the policy that I think dogged Obama's efforts for the rest of his time in office. And that was the policy that Russia would not be willing to negotiate on a new reduction treaty until the central limits of the New START treaty were accomplished. And that would be in February of 2018, clearly after President Obama had left office. Mm-hmm. So again, I think with the right diplomacy and with a lot of hard work, perhaps that could have been reversed, but it was not to be. We had the invasion of Crimea I've already referred to, but we also then had their egregious violation of the INF treaty that eventually led to U.S. withdrawal from the INF treaty. But the Russians were not on the same wavelength is a nice way to say it.
Well, so we're going to get to audience questions now. Stanley Kober asks on YouTube about what you just said. He says, we have withdrawn from the INF treaty, claiming Russia is in violation, a claim you have endorsed. does it make sense then to negotiate a new treaty as long as this matter is unresolved?
One thing I want to mention is I've been in a lot of track 2 conversations with the Russians recently, and what's fascinating is that they are mourning the loss of the INF treaty. All of a sudden, they are continuing to watch the proliferation of intermediate range ground launch systems around their Eurasian periphery, and they are beginning to get increasingly worried that there are no negotiated constraints anymore. Putin has already put on the table a moratorium offer in Europe that actually puts this missile, the 9M729 missile that is their egregious violation of the INF treaty, he's put it on the table saying, we don't admit it flies to intermediate range, but we will agree to a moratorium to remove it from European Russia and agree to monitoring and verification measures to ensure that it's not present in European Russia. Now, of course, their goal is to keep the new U.S. ground-launched conventional missile out of Europe, but that, it's an interesting offer. It deserves looking at. And now, what happens when all those missiles move east of the Urals? Suddenly, the Chinese sit up and take notice. And I do think that the Chinese are beginning to get a bit nervous about the proliferation of these missile systems themselves. Here's an area where China has some equality of capability and numbers with the United States and Russia. They too, no doubt, want to keep U.S. ground-launched conventional missiles out of Asia, that in this intermediate range. So I think there could be some possibilities for essentially restoring constraints on intermediate range forces. Interesting question. We're not going to return to the overarching ban of the INF treaty. So can we place limits on nuclear missiles in this range? Can we ban nuclear missiles in this range? I think there's some interesting policy questions out there that will have to be addressed. But that's how I would answer Stanley Kober's question that, yeah, we haven't resolved this issue by getting the Russians to destroy the 9M729, but they are willing now to place limits on it. And we should figure out how to advance those limits and get what we need, particularly in working with the Chinese on this matter as well, because these missiles, where they have some equivalents of capability, are carrier killers. They are the missiles that concern us very much, given our naval deployments in the Far East. And so we need to, I think, also be talking to the Chinese very seriously about this matter.
Well, you talk about the Chinese. That was one thing the Trump administration said it wanted to do before renewing New START, was to find a way of doing a 3-way treaty with Russia, China, and the United States on nuclear arms. We have questions that we're putting together from Jill Doherty and Amy Gordon on this topic. How should the U.S. and Russia take into account the implications of a new bilateral nuclear negotiation for other nuclear powers, especially China? And how do you bring China into future negotiations if they, at this point, reject that?
Yes, well, in order to get China to the table, as always, they are going to have to see their interests served. They won't come to the table to be nice, that's for sure. And they won't come to the table because they're bullied. So we have to figure out what will serve their interests. And to my mind, it's this area where there is some equivalence of capability and where they are worried about, they'll never admit they're worried about Russia and having more 9M729s in the far eastern part of the Russian Federation. They won't admit that, but I think they keep a sharp eye on what the Russians are up to, as the Russians keep a sharp eye on what they're up to. And they certainly, I think, have a goal of keeping intermediate range U.S. ground launch systems out of Asia. So here's an area where there's some equivalence of numbers and capability, and some, I would say, national security interests on each side that could bring each of the parties to the table. So I think we need to develop that. It's not going to be easy to begin a negotiation because the Chinese aren't used to negotiating about placing constraints on their systems, but opening a discussion early, getting them to the table, talking about where their interests may lie, and really hearing about what our plans are with regard to deploying such missiles, I think would pique their interest as well as their concern. So there'll be some hard work to do, but I think we can get them to the table. It's this equivalence of capability that leads to an equivalence of I would say, finding some national security goal that they need to see served. By the way, other areas where there's equivalence of interest and equivalence of some capability, space-based assets, new Chinese space-based assets, as well as hypersonic glide vehicles in various ranges. They have a good deal of capability there, as do the Russians. So these could be some other areas where we could engage the Chinese early. But it was with regard to strategic nuclear forces, we have to keep a sharp eye on the Chinese modernization. I know that's what the Trump administration was so concerned about. We have to keep a sharp eye on it, but the numbers are still much, much lower than the U.S. and Russian deployments of strategic nuclear forces. They're 1/10 of what we and the Russians deploy. We and the Russians still have 90% of the nuclear weapons in the world. So let's keep a sharp eye on what the Chinese are up to, but I don't think we have to panic. Meanwhile, let's work on getting them to the table where, first of all, we have an interest, but also they will have an interest that will actually bring them to the table.
So Daniel Offman asks on YouTube, Serhii Plokhy, who of course has a new book out on the Cuban Missile Crisis, has said that today the world is in more danger of nuclear confrontation than, for the most part, the days of the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis, of course, comes to mind. Would you agree with that?
By the way, I've just read the reviews of Serhii Plokhy's book. It sounds wonderful. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but it really sounds like he was able to make use of some new archives that have opened up. So I'll endorse it without even having read it. He does such excellent work.
He does.
The difference is, I'll be curious to read the book to see what he has to say about this matter. But the difference is we really do have so many more lines of communication open now than we did during those days, with all the bad relations right now between Moscow and Washington, and the fact that our ambassadors are not present in capitals. Ambassador Sullivan is back in Washington as well for consultations, as Antonov is in Moscow for consultations. But there are multiple other ways that we do and can communicate. And for example, President Biden offered this summit meeting. I understand they're looking to schedule it sometime in June. And clearly there are lots of communications going back and forth between Moscow and Washington now to try to get that summit meeting organized. That's just a small example, but I think we just have many, many more means of communicating today and understanding more about what's going on behind the scenes. Not perfect knowledge, of course, but frankly, thanks to some of your work and other media correspondents who are able to dig deep into what's going on behind the scenes. So I do think that it's different from 1962 in my view today, and I see really a qualitative difference that continues. Some of it as simple as having somebody's mobile phone number and being able to send them a quiet SMS message or a quiet WhatsApp message. We just have more means of communicating, and to my mind, that helps. It helps to make it less of a destabilizing situation than in the past.
William Alberk asks, do you have advice for state and OSD to prepare their personnel for future talks and possible negotiations? Any specific training or reading, which of course includes your book,
of course,
they should be yeah, exactly, sending out to people?
Honestly, people ask me this question all the time, and it's a really good question because we have reason to be concerned. We know that younger generations of students aren't that interested in nuclear weapons. We don't have, the thousands and thousands out on the street demonstrating, concerned about nuclear weapons that we had during the 1980s, for example. It's just an issue that's more on the back burner. But I'll say two things about this. One, that I've noticed that more students are interested in these sets of issues. And I've done a lot of lectures, both at Stanford, but in different university settings in the last year. And these courses are filling up. So that's a good feeling that students are actually interested in learning about the history of the Cold War, but also about nuclear negotiations and what is necessary in future. That's a good feeling. But more importantly than that, I would say, while we have people in our governments who are both experts, who are responsible for operational deployment of our nuclear weapon systems, and inspectors who are going on active inspections in the Russian Federation, we have a store of expertise that is simply amazing. I had teams of these experts come to join our negotiations in Geneva. many of them, unless they'd happened to be inspectors, if they'd been on a submarine or in an ICBM silo, of course, they never saw a Russian before. But they turned out to be some of the most natural negotiators I have ever seen because they spoke the same technical language with their Russian counterparts, and they really could get things done at the negotiating table. Of course, they didn't speak Russian. Of course, their Russian counterparts didn't speak English. But that goes to say a lot for the role of linguists and translators. They're very important to a successful negotiation too. But as long as we have people who are working in operational deployment of our nuclear forces, and we have active inspection teams, we'll have the experts we need for future negotiations. I'm quite convinced of that.
One last quick question. I'm going to butcher this name, Piotr. I'm sorry, Piotr Tobrishkanov. I'm not sure I'm getting that right. Asks on YouTube. Says, Rose, thank you. Why was the New START given a 10-year duration with an option for only for 1 5-year extension? Why not longer? What was the vision here?
That is a funny question, Piotr. Piotr, by the way, was one of the research assistants at the Carnegie Moscow Center when I was director there, and now has gone from strength to strength and is a very good senior researcher now. So I'm glad he was able to join our call today. Well, it was funny because we were facing at that time the problem with extension of the START treaty, and it wasn't possible to extend it. And I simply turned to my lawyer and said, why don't we write an extension clause into New START so we can extend it for 5 years if we need to? And he said, 3 years or 5 years? And I said, 5 years. I think 5 years would be better. And so we wrote it into our draft of the treaty. I broached it to the Russians. They said, fine, sounds great. Yeah, we understand it's kind of tough now that START's going out of force and we don't have that means to extend it. So yeah, let's put it in the new treaty. But sometimes that's how things happen in negotiations. Somebody has a good idea and they just stick it in and it gets accepted by all sides. I won't say I was the only one who had this good idea. It was my lawyer, Paul Dean, who helped me write it up, and he was very effective on the negotiations as well.
Well, I want to thank everybody for all the good questions. Rose, you want to say anything to wrap up here? What anything we didn't get to? We talk a little bit about the book that you're coming out. Everybody should buy it, by the way. Negotiating New START. Order it today. It's a fabulous read, and you're going to enjoy it and get a lot out of it. So I hope people will read it.
Well, I'll just say for all you women in the audience, I will be very interested if you have any comments about my experiences over the years, and including trying to do the superwoman job. So I really will welcome your comments and some sympathetic remarks, perhaps. But anyway, thank you so very much, and thank you, Peter, for a great interview. I really enjoyed it a lot.
Well, it was a lot of fun for me. I hope everybody who tuned in today enjoyed it. Thank you very much for participating, and thank you, Rose, for writing this book and for talking with it about it today. I think at this point we're wrapping up, and we'll hope to do something like this again sometime soon. Thanks, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you.